Explaining the First Crusade. By the dawn of the 11th century, Western Europe and the Catholic Church no longer had to face threats such as the Vikings. The stability that this created allowed the Christians to retake lands that the Muslims had conquered, such as Spain and southern Italy, though there was still problems with the Church. The East and West Church had split in the Great Schism, and culture within Western Europe was extremely violent, and the kings and the Pope were both vying for power. Events such as the investiture controversy of 1075 awoke public interest in Christian piety. Christian pilgrims were also returning from the Holy Lands and reporting of atrocities. These atrocities included the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and attacks on the Great German Pilgrimage of 1065. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire was having a really hard time fighting off the Seljuk Empire, especially after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. That battle would force the Byzantines out of much of Anatolia. Even though the Seljuk Empire would split into different states, they would still fight the Byzantines and would eventually threaten Constantinople. Because of all this, in 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos would send an envoy to Pope Urban. Pope Urban jumped at the chance of uniting Christendom under him instead of the anti-pope, Clement III. Pope Urban would go to France and, at the Council of Clermont, would make a speech about the Muslim atrocities. This was in an attempt to unite the nobility to the cause. Word would spread around Europe of this, and many powerful princes would go to Constantinople. These princes included Robert, Duke of Normandy, Raymond IV of Toulouse, Bowman of Toronto, and Godfrey of Boulogne. None of these people, however, were the first to arrive in Constantinople. Instead, it would be a group of poorly trained peasants. These peasants would be led by Peter the Hermit, a priest. They would attempt to invade Anatolia and would be quickly killed by the Seljuks. The real Crusaders would arrive the following spring. Crusaders would agree to give all Byzantine territory back to the emperor after they invaded Anatolia. In Anatolia, they would capture Nicaea in June of 1097. In July, they would defeat the Seljuks at the Battle of Dorylaeum, freeing up their path through Anatolia. They would reach the important city of Antioch, but because they could not fully surround the city, the siege would take much longer than expected. With rising casualties, there was a disagreement between Bohemond and Byzantine general Tatikias. Tatikias would withdraw from the siege, and so Bohemond would withdraw his agreement with the Byzantines, though the Byzantines had already strengthened their position in Anatolia. Shortly thereafter, Baldwin of Urloin would persuade the Christian ruler of Edessa to crown him heir, and would create a new county bordering Armenia. Meanwhile, rumors were spreading that a large Muslim army was heading for Antioch. Because of this, Bohemond would bribe an Armenian tower guard to allow them into the city, where they would then slaughter the Muslims inside. The advancing Seljuk army would arrive 3 days later under Kurbiger, and would siege the city. Meanwhile, within the city, a French priest discovered something that he thought was the lance that had stabbed Jesus. This would boost the morale of the Crusaders, who would then march out of the city and defeat the besiegers. They now had control of the city, and Bohemond would be crowned the Prince of Antioch. The Crusaders, led by Godfrey of Boulogne, would march south for Jerusalem. They would eventually make it to Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders set about building siege engines, and, with the help of Italy, they would do just that. In June, they would successfully siege Jerusalem, and, once again, murder its inhabitants. They would then march to meet the Fatimids, who, I forgot to mention, were in control of Jerusalem, at Ascalon. The Crusaders were outnumbered, but, despite that, they won the battle and secured their control over Jerusalem. Godfrey of Boulogne would die just a year later, but his brother Baldwin would take the title of King of Jerusalem in 1100. This would give his old title, Count of Edessa, to his cousin, Barak. In conclusion, the First Crusade was a battle of religions, being Christianity and Islam. Though the Crusaders had won, it would take many more crusades to establish their control over the region. Thank you for watching this video on the First Crusade.